All right. And with that, let me first of all wish you all a after the fact Shana Tova, Happy New Year. I hope you all had a wonderful celebration of your holidays, both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We've gone through a very exhaustive holiday cycle, and I hope all of you had a chance to celebrate together with your family and friends. A couple of comments. Tonight marks the beginning of year 3 of the Adult Center for Jewish Learning. Believe it or not, it is 3 years since we started our program. And I am excited to be able to tell you that there are a lot of wonderful activities and programs and classes that are in store for us. And we will be sending you out more information as time goes on so you can participate in whatever programs you choose to participate in. The Adult Center for Jewish Learning was established 3 years ago to provide classes, current events programs, holiday events, lectures, and discussions on Jewish importance for the entire community. Whether you are Jewish or not, the Learning Center is designed to produce Jewish programming for everyone. I should mention that the Adult Center is a nonprofit educational organization. It is open to everyone who would like to participate, who would like to learn. There is no enrollment that is required for any of our courses, although we sometimes ask people to indicate if they're going to be taking a class. There are no contributions that we solicit, although periodically I will send you out information about the support of the center. So we are a group of learners who have come together to study and to learn about subjects of Jewish interest. Tonight, we begin our new session, our 3rd year, with a political discussion that involves, interestingly enough, both the United States and Israel. Those of you who are here probably received the flyers. Tonight's discussion, lecture, presentation is called The Elections of November. Elections, plural, because there are 2 different elections that are taking place in the month of November. One is taking place November the 1st. That's Tuesday, November the 1st. And those are the elections that are taking place in Israel, which we will talk about briefly. And then 1 week later, on the 8th, elections will be held in the United States, November 8th. These are the midterm elections in which a lot of very important issues will be decided and a lot of candidates and will be selected for the next 2 years. Having said that, let me share with you a couple of interesting points. There's a great deal of commonality between the United States and Israel. First of all, we are both democracies. Israel is a parliamentary democracy. We in the United States are a democratic republic. We both are committed to values of fairness and justice. And both Israel and the United States are very used to voting. I would say that if anything, the number of people who vote in Israel is probably higher than the percentage of Americans who generally vote. The general statistics are that at least 80% of all eligible Israelis vote in Israeli elections. And the elections turnout is very good, and virtually all Israelis who are able to participate in the election process. Now, having said that, I should tell you that another thing that is similar between the United States and Israel is that both countries vote fairly regularly. The United States, we vote every 2 years for midterm elections and every 4 years for national or presidential elections. Israel votes more frequently than that. If I were to tell you that this coming election in Israel on November 1st will mark the 5th time in 4 years that Israelis have been called upon to vote, you can imagine how hectic things are in Israel. Israel are voting for a 5th time in November, and there's a good chance that the election results in November won't be decisive. And I could even suggest to you that we might be even going to a sixth election in the not distant future. Israel and America both are evenly divided between the public opinions in the country. I think it's fair to say that even though the United States has many different political parties, Libertarian, Independent, American Independent, Green Party, so forth. There are two major parties in the United States. Those parties are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And most of the seats that will be won in the coming elections will be divided between Democrats and Republicans. I can tell you the same thing is true in Israel. However, it's not Democrats and Republicans. Israel is divided between what we call the center-right parties and the center-left parties. And all Israelis, believe it or not, can fall into one of those two groups. But there is a difference between the United States and Israel, even though Israel is pretty evenly divided between the right and the left, just like the United States is evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. The truth of the matter is that the political process in Israel is very different than the United States. Let me just mention that briefly. In the United States, we will all go out to our polls, or we will send in our absentee ballots, and we will vote for candidates. And most of us will choose a particular candidate. Many of them will be from either the Republican or the Democratic Party. In Israel, Israelis do not vote for individual candidates. There is no individual candidate voting in Israel. In Israel, when you want to vote, you have to vote for a political party. That's the way it works. And just so you have an idea, there are currently 40 parties that are going to be running in Israeli elections. Believe me, I have the list. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but there are 40 separate parties that qualify for elections in the Knesset this year, which means that Israelis have to go to the polls and they have to suggest a political party. They have to decide on a political party to cast their vote for. And then based upon the popular vote, the parties will divide up the candidates, will divide up the number of positions there are for the Israeli Knesset. Let me spend just a few minutes talking about Israel. I'm going to have introduced you in a few moments, Hal, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. But I just want to tell you something interesting about Israel. Israel is based on political parties. When you go to the polls, you vote for a party. I said there are 40 political parties that are represented in Israel's upcoming elections. The truth is, 40 parties will not make their way into the final Knesset. That's impossible. It's impossible because to get a vote in the Knesset, Israel has what's called the threshold law or the threshold vote. In order to be a party in the Knesset, you must have 3.25% of the total vote of the Israeli vote, at least that to qualify for one seat in the Knesset, and there are 120 seats in the Knesset. Any party that doesn't poll 3.25% will not make it into the Knesset, which means 20 to 30 parties are not going to make it into the Knesset this time, and the seats will be divided up among the 12 or so parties that actually are selected. Now, what happens is basically this. Let me just give you a brief rundown of what's happening. After Israelis go to the polls on November the 1st, votes will be tabulated, and then based on the threshold vote, we will decide on which parties are going to form the next Knesset. Knesset is Israel's parliament. It has 120 seats. Each party is given a percentage of votes based upon this 120-seat Knesset, which means if someone wins 10% of the vote in Israel, theoretically they can win 12 seats in the Knesset. Now, it has never been the case that one political party has won it all. I will tell you, not since Israel was founded has any political party received 61 plus seats in the Knesset. It's never happened. So how does Israel form a stable government? Well, the answer is very simple. After the elections, the Israeli parties come together, they figure out how many seats they have, and then through a process of horse trading, of negotiating, they have to create what is called a stable government. What is a stable government? In order to have a stable Israeli government, you need 61 seats. And actually, because you can always lose seats throughout a period of time, it's probably better to have 65, 66, 67 seats. So what's going to happen is after the Israeli elections on the 1st, there's going to be a whole lot of horse trading going on. We probably won't know the nature of the Israeli government till 3 or even 4 weeks after the Israeli elections. So you will not know the night of Israel's elections what the composition of the government is. We're all going to have to wait. But allow me to mention a couple of things that I think will be of interest before I introduce our moderator tonight. First of all, the things that Israelis are concerned about in their elections are the things we Americans are concerned about in our elections. If I were to ask you, which I won't because I've silenced you all, but if I were to ask you, what are most Americans concerned with, you would probably say the majority of Americans are concerned with the economy. It's economy, stupid. Well, the truth is that's true of Israel as well. 44% of Israelis, it is now polled, are concerned about their economy, the economy in Israel, and the various economic plans that each of the parties represent. The second most important factor in both Israel and the United States is also the same, and that has to do with politics. The second most important factor in Israel, 24% of Israelis will cast their vote based on the political party and its leadership. So if you go to the polls and you know which person you want to lead and which party you want to have the predominance, you're going to vote for that party, and 24% of Israelis make their decision based upon that. Finally, about 20% of Israelis will cast their vote based on which party seems to be best able to bring the different factions, left, right, and center together, which party has the best chance of forming a kind of national unity government, a government that brings all the factions together and unites them in one government. And finally, about 12% of Israelis, that's all the rest, vote depending on things like religion and state, foreign policy, foreign relations, state security, all kinds of other issues. That's about 12%. If you do the math, that's 100%. And I'm not exactly sure about all this, but it's 100%. So, like the United States, people who vote in Israel will be basing their votes on different issues, and those issues will decide which party they vote for. Now, I told you there are a number of parties. I've told you a number of other different factors. Let me tell you one other factor I think you should know. That in Israel, a lot of people are still yet undecided about their final vote. It would be nice if I told you that 90% or 100% of Israelis are certain about what they're going to do. The truth is, I go on to the polls all the time, and you cannot get really good, adequate statistics. It depends on turnout. It depends on turnout of other parties. One of the big questions is, will the Arab parties turn out in large numbers? There are 3 Arab parties. If over 40% of the Arabs who are eligible to vote in Israeli elections turn out, it will have a decisive impact on the effect of the election. Another question is, how successful will the established parties be in bringing out their voters? It's interesting to note that about 300,000 Likud voters are currently on the fence as to whether they're going to be voting or not. 300,000 votes is a lot of votes. So it will depend upon how successful the parties are in bringing out their constituencies to the vote. And finally, the issue will be based on where the religious voters will go to in this election. A lot of the parties have positions now on their list for religious voters. So having said that, and that is a very brief introduction, and I'm more than happy later on to share any other information you're interested in, we decided that we were going to focus tonight on the issue that we are all going to be able to have an influence on and effect, and those are the elections in the United States that take place on November the 8th. Hopefully you've all received your ballots in the mail. Hopefully you all have either cast those ballots or have looked at them, and you will be either sending them in or going to the polls. We can make a difference here in the United States, and therefore it is important for us to consider the issue we raised tonight, which is the following. This November, important elections will be taking place in both the United States and Israel. Please join us for an in-depth political discussion concerning the issues and challenges that these elections pose to both Israel and to the American Jewish community. Learn how both of these crucial elections will affect the relationship between Israel and the United States in the future, both the elections in 2022, the ones coming up, and the ones we are looking for in 2024. Well, that is our discussion for this evening. I am going to keep myself quiet because I tend to talk too much. Thank you to all of you who are here. Happy New Year to all of you. If I haven't wished you Happy New Year, thank you for your good wishes. Tonight, I would like to introduce to you the gentleman who will actually be moderating tonight's discussion. And actually, he is already well known to many of you, especially those of you from Santa Clarita. Mr. Hauss, who is a prominent political consultant, has worked for many years in the area of political advocacy, has worked in the past for former Governor Pat Brown, Senator John Glenn, Treasurer Jess Unruh, former President Al Gore. He goes back actually as far as the campaign of Hubert Humphrey. He has also managed scores of campaigns, and he comments regularly for local and national media. Now, Hal's knowledge of the elections in the states is pretty formidable. And so Hal will be leading the discussion tonight with our guest speaker, who Hal will introduce. I would like to say just one final word, and then I'm going to stop. If you have any questions, just indicate in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, indicate your name, and if you can, the question in the chat, indicate in the chat the question you would like to ask, and I will try and call on as many people as we can tonight. We're given restraints, as many people as we can call upon to ask their questions. With that, I am going to silence myself, and I'll hopefully, if I haven't silenced everybody else, I'll silence the last couple of people who are on. The only people who will not be silenced over this next period of time, which will last from now till about 8 o'clock, about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes, will be Hal and our guest speaker. At 8 o'clock promptly, or as close to that as possible, we will go into Q&A, and I will try and leave as much time as I can to give you all an opportunity to ask your questions. And now it is with great pleasure I introduce Mr. Hauss.
Thank you, Rabbi, and welcome to everybody. A lot of friends, and Rabbi Hauss has been my rabbi up here. Gail's and mine for many, many years. We're good friends with Ron and Randy, traveled together and studied together, and glad to be part of this. And as much as I allegedly know, our special guest has 10 times more of the knowledge and experience than I do. And Dan Schnur is our special guest, and we've known each other for many years. We've done projects together, and he is one of the foremost political experts and educators in the United States. And he is a professor, not at one university, but at 3, USC, Pepperdine, and also Cal Berkeley. And he teaches at the Annenberg School and the other communications and political science arms at those universities. He's also taught at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, and George Washington. He started the USC, sorry, wrong school, the USC LA Times poll, which is a statewide poll. He currently does an LA World Affairs Council show. It was monthly, now it's weekly because it's so popular for the LA World Affairs Council. He has a website, and we'll give you that web address. You can follow his political writings. He also is a regular contributor and staff writer, columnist for the LA Jewish Journal. Dan has worked at 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns over his career, and he has worked for many prominent political figures. He also was appointed to the State of California Fair Political Practices Commission. That's the one that regulates our campaigns and elections, and contributed mightily to adding new requirements and new policies to that organization. And he also, not as if this is all he does, he also has been a consultant to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the Broad Education Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust, the James Irvine Foundation, and the Public Policy Institute of California. He's also a board member of the LA Museum of the Holocaust, and former director of the American Jewish Committee in Los Angeles, and also a consultant to the LA Jewish Federation. He also crosses the loyalty lines and spends time at the Luskin School at UCLA to give them some equal time. And he's commented on national and international politics for the New York Times, on CNN, on Fox, and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. So he is very accomplished. And our format is I will pose some questions, starting with general questions about the election, and then we'll kind of riff off into the impact on American Jews and Israel. And then in the Q&A, you can ask about Netanyahu and Lapid and Gantz and all of that. So save up your questions. And so we'll go to 8, and then we'll do some Q&A. So Dan, welcome. We are delighted you could join us tonight.
Well, Hal, thank you so much for having me. Thank you also to Rabbi Hauss and to all of you for letting me join you. I just think that the programs that the Rabbi runs are just so phenomenal and so important, and I'm flattered to be able to be a part of them. I was also very much appreciated your generous introduction of me, Hal. But if I know 1/10 about politics, what you know, as opposed to 10 times as much as you suggested, I'm doing pretty well. So let's go ahead and get started.
Very good. So we'll start with a general question. We're 2 weeks out, as the rabbi said, from the election. Most people believe, most pundits believe that the Republicans in the US own the springtime. The Democrats kind of pulled ahead in the summertime because of Roe and some of the other factors. But with inflation still with us, many people believe that the Republicans have gained the momentum, and recent polls in a lot of states show races that were widely Democratic are narrowing significantly, and Republicans have pulled ahead in a lot of them. And we're talking about congressional, U.S. House and Senate races, which of course will impact foreign policy, domestic policy, and of course, our topic tonight, Israel. So Dan, a little general observation and scene setting on where we stand 2 weeks out.
Well, you just gave a terrific overview of it, Hal. And so the first thing I'll do is agree with that overview. If we had done this program, you and the rabbi and I, in April, we would have talked about the various historical forces that in all likelihood have made this, in all likelihood, a very strong year for Republicans. And those historical forces are so strong that over the last 100 years, there have only been 3 midterm elections in a president's first term in which the president's party gained seats rather than lost them. And the 3 exceptions to that, going backwards, one, the most recent, was in 2002, 20 years ago, when George Bush's Republican Party gained seats in Congress barely a year after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, when national security was such a critical issue for most voters. Before that, you have to go back another 40 years to John F. Kennedy's first midterm elections, which took place very shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And before that, you've got to go back another almost 30 years to Franklin Roosevelt's first midterm elections, which of course took place at the height of the Great Depression, when Congress was only beginning its efforts to implement FDR's New Deal. So had we had this conversation in the spring, Hal, I would have told you that if it takes a Great Depression, a missile crisis, or a terrorist attacks in order to upset a formula in which the out party almost always wins seats in the midterm election, that would have been a pretty good historical precedent. Now, the Democrats argued that, in fact, the 2022 did have the opportunity to present just as dramatic an exception. They pointed, number one, to the unprecedented role that former President Trump is playing on the campaign trail, and felt that in a lot of contested races, that could work to their benefit. But second, as you mentioned, Hal, the Supreme Court's seminal Dobbs decision in June to overturn Roe versus Wade is unprecedented in American history, in which that we've never seen such a critical court decision made in such close proximity to a general election. So if we talked about this over the summer, I would have said, well, Hal, historical precedent notwithstanding, it looked like Dobbs and or Trump might put Democrats in a better position than history would expect. But as the summer has turned into fall, as all of you know, gasoline prices have gone back up, inflation has continued to rage. And most interestingly, while the majority, very strong majorities of American voters disagree with the court's decision on Dobbs, as months have passed, we're now almost 5 months since that decision, and the level of import that voters put on abortion rights has gradually dissipated since June. So while I learned in November of 2016 to never make political predictions, I would say, in agreement to your very astute analysis, that while certainly nothing is guaranteed, it appears that Republicans have regained the momentum. And it's much more likely than not at this point that Republicans will regain a House majority. The Senate at this point, and we can dig in a little bit deeper in a minute if you like, the Senate at this point is probably pretty close to up for grabs. And what looked like an obvious Republican advantage in April and a likely Democratic advantage in August is now pretty much of a jump ball. So that's much longer of an answer than I think you wanted, but we got a lot of ground to cover. So I'll quiet down and we'll keep going.
So let me just segue into the next question. So we have three scenarios. The Congress remains the same. One scenario, Democrats control the House. The Senate is, close with Kamala Harris breaking a tie. That's one scenario. Second scenario is the Republicans win both houses, barely in the Senate, probably more comfortably in the House. And the third is split government. What does that mean for national policy? And riffing off of that, what might it mean for the outlook for Israel? We certainly have Schumer and Pelosi if the party stays this, if the Democrats control the Congress. We have Kevin McCarthy ostensibly being the leader in the House if the Republicans take the House, and Mitch McConnell potentially being the majority leader in the Senate. What does that mean again for U.S. general policy, foreign policy, and Israel?
Okay. So for the most part, there's no question that if the Democrats are able to maintain their majorities or even expand them, that makes it much more likely that Biden is going to be able to move forward on the agenda that he's begun implementing over the previous 2 years. In particular, if the Democrats are able to gain 2 Senate seats and have a majority of 52 rather than 50, that would represent the single most likely change because that would allow the Senate Democrats to suspend the filibuster. And a great deal of legislation, including a bill that Biden has talked about, which would codify Roe versus Wade into statute, a lot of legislation that has passed narrowly in the Senate, has passed narrowly in the House, but has died in the Senate because of the 60 vote requirement. If this filibuster were suspended, in other words, if the Democrats had 50 votes without Senators Manchin and Sinema, that would really open up the floodgates for Biden to begin to move his agenda forward in a much more expansive way than has been the case. If the Republicans were to win either or both chambers, then I think you can assume that Biden's domestic policy agenda, at least, is pretty well stopped for the next 2 years. On an internet, just because it's almost impossible to imagine either small Republican majorities in either chamber doing very much to help the president move his next policy goals forward. On a foreign policy basis, we saw a really interesting dynamic emerge this week in which Republican House Leader McCarthy announced that a Republican-controlled House would look more carefully at continued aid to Ukraine. And that not only caused great consternation from Biden and from Democrats, but several leading Republicans, including the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, made it clear that the US still had an obligation to support Ukraine. But because of the increasingly isolationist tendencies we're seeing among both the most conservative Republicans and the most progressive of Democrats, it's entirely possible that with the Republican-controlled Congress, that it might be become more difficult for the US to continue to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Real quickly on Israel, and then we can move on once again. On this one, I don't think there'd be a great deal of difference between the two parties. Both parties, particularly Republicans, talk very aggressively about how much more supportive of Israel they are than their opponents. And there are issues that we saw, particularly during the Trump administration and at other times in recent history, where a Republican-led administration has marched more closely in lockstep with the Israeli government. But truth be told, I doubt there would be a significant difference between the two parties on Israel, regardless of which one elected a House Speaker or Senate Majority Leader.
So following up that question, we are seeing a lot of issues that trouble all of us in the United States, from the squad on one side and BDS to white nationalists on the other, and the flag demonstrations and Jews will not replace us, etc. You know, you say the majority of both parties support Israel, and I would tend to agree with that. But with the candidates out there across the country, there are many on the left and many on the right that are questioning our commitment and our role to supporting Israel. So I wouldn't say we're being whipsawed yet, because there aren't that many numbers, but there are troubling signs for a lot of us with the rise of the fringe elements of both parties.
Well, Hal, I couldn't agree with you more. And I should clarify that even just because I don't see much of a difference in terms of US-Israel relations, regardless of which party controls Congress, that does not mean for a moment that I'm not equally just as concerned as you are about the increasingly powerful threats to the US relationship on both extremes of the political spectrum. And as you correctly pointed out, just as we see ultranationalism oozing into anti-Semitism on the extreme right, the most ardent anti-Zionism oozes into anti-Semitism on the far left as well. It's this very significant challenge in both parties. What I will say, and I don't want to minimize for a second, the anti-Semitic sentiments among nativists on the conservative extreme. But when it comes to Israel, we actually see polling information that suggests that the challenge is greater in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. The Pew Research Center polled not too long ago that showed that only 44% of Democratic voters and independents who lean toward the Democratic Party hold positive feelings toward Israel, while 53% hold unfavorable opinions. Those numbers are roughly reversed a bit more on the other side. More than a bit, 71% of Republicans and independents who lean toward Republicans feel positively about Israel. But among self-described liberal Democrats, only 36% of liberal Democrats think favorably of Israel, while 62% hold unfavorable opinions. And I want to be clear here. Although I worked in Republican politics for many years, I became a no-party preference voter many years ago. And I'm not being partisan about this at all. I'm very, very concerned about anti-Semitism on the right. But we do have data that shows that the driving force behind the growing anti-Israel sentiment in American politics does come from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which presents a particular challenge for American Jews, who of course lean overwhelmingly Democratic in their voting preference. Israel has tremendously stalwart supporters in the Democratic Party, starting with the president, with Speaker Pelosi, and Senate Majority Leader Schumer. But we are seeing an increasing number of elected representatives and grassroots voters who have real suspicion about the relationship. And just like fighting anti-Semitism on the right is an important challenge, we can't lose sight of how this anti-Zionism can manifest itself into much more dangerous sentiments on the left.
A big issue that is of concern to the US, to Jews, and to the world is what's known as the JCPOA, the Iran deal. Biden is criticized from both sides. Russia is a factor in all of this, and Netanyahu was on the air today talking about his relationship with Russia, and he talked about security in Israel, and he did condemn, of course, Ukraine. But what happens in the various scenarios, and maybe Rabbi wants to jump in, I may drag you into this, on the Iran nuclear issue. Some people think Biden is moving toward it, releasing money. Other people are pushing back. And yet we see also, and Russia has a role in all this because of its role in the Middle East. And Iran is supplying drones to Russia in Ukraine, and they're all mucking around in Lebanon and Syria. Very complicated stuff. What's the kind of thinking about all of this, and how our foreign policy is shaped by the ongoing nuclear discussion?
I will defer in a moment to the rabbi because he's much more expert on this than I am. And I see that Phil Levy asked a really smart question in the chat when I was talking about the differences between the two parties. And he asked about the parties' differences on Iran. And there's no question that Republicans have been much more strong in their opposition to a nuclear agreement with Iran than the Democrats. And Phil is exactly right about that. That said, I think the news of recent days, in which we've learned that not only are Iranian drone missiles being used by Russia in the war against Ukraine, but in fact, Iranian militia are assisting Russian troops in the deployment of those drones. Aside from the incredibly complicated geopolitical challenges that creates, and hopefully we can talk about further, as it relates to the nuclear agreement, I think it kills it. It's absolutely impossible to see a situation in which the US signs a nuclear agreement with Iran at the same time that the Iranians are supporting drone missiles, even ballistic missiles, to Russia in the war in Ukraine. Rabbi, I'll defer to you.
No, I would also agree with that, Dan. And I also want to point out that there are a lot of former Russians in Israel right now. And so with the elections going on in Israel, not a lot of people are talking about this. But my guess is that right after the Israeli elections, you're going to hear a lot of former Russians who are now Israeli citizens being very vocal on both sides of the issue as to what should be taking place and what Israel's policy should be vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis the Ukraine, because Israel has people who are supportive of Ukraine, and there are some Israelis probably who are also supportive of Russia.
Just switching back again to political involvement, this involves Jewish groups on both sides of the aisle, unprecedented involvement in United States elections, mainly spending money in congressional districts, AIPAC on one side, Republican Jewish coalition, J Street on the other side, and progressive groups on the other side, spending millions and millions of dollars to elect pro-Israel candidates. You know, I could be wrong, but I think this level of involvement is historic, unprecedented. But will there be ramifications and blowback once the dust settles?
Boy, really, really smart question, Hal. And the short answer, not that I can constrain myself to a short answer, is yes. But just to expand for a moment, I'd offer two observations. You're right, and this level of involvement is unprecedented. But observation number one, it's notable that the independent committees that are spending lavishly on behalf of pro-Israel candidates, in their advertising, are almost never mentioning Israel. And when there is a candidate who has voted in Israel's interest for many in the past, the ads might talk about inflation, they might talk about abortion, they might talk about immigration. They're talking about issues on which the candidate and the voters agree. And the reticence that these independent pro-Israel organizations have to talk about Israel in their advocacy reinforces the point that we were discussing just a couple minutes ago, that simply put, that they know for many of these audiences, being pro-Israel is no longer a winning issue, and that electing pro-Israel Democrats in particular, although some on the Republican side also, means emphasizing other issues instead, not to mislead the voters, but to emphasize those in which there's a greater likelihood of agreement. And then second, at the conclusion of your question, Hal, you made an extremely smart point, even more than usual, which is the aggressiveness in particular with which AIPAC and its affiliates are advertising on behalf of pro-Israel candidates, a stance which, for the record, I would applaud, also exacerbates the growing progressive suspicions toward Israel. Words, if you are a progressive Democratic voter and a pro-Israel PAC has taken out your favorite candidate, then you're going to have that much more motivation to be more aggressive in your criticism. So while I think whether it's from J Street or AIPAC or any other pro-Israel organization to engage the way they do, we'd be naive if we didn't recognize that some blowback does come with those decisions.
One interesting factor over the last couple of elections, Democrats have generally had overwhelming support on election day from three key groups: Latinos, or Latinx, if you want to use the new term, African Americans, and Jews. But what we've seen, part of it was when Trump ran, and now we've seen a little bit of erosion. Democrats still overwhelmingly, Jews vote for Democrats and Latino, but the numbers are going down a bit. And in close elections, in congressional elections and Senate elections around the country, and Republicans are making a huge effort in get out the vote, in mobilization, along the border states, for example. Many American Latinos don't like the immigration policies of the Democrats, or non-policies, or whatever, record numbers of illegal immigrants to this country. And there are a lot more Jews who are concerned about the Democratic drift from BDS, the Squad, plus Israel. And African Americans don't think that Democrats, they take them for granted and haven't done enough. Do you see trends that make this concerning to Democrats, that in close races, these changes could tip certain races?
I do think that's a very legitimate concern for Democrats. First, let's make it clear, is that the Democrats enjoy immense majorities still among all three voter groups. But what Trump demonstrated in 2020, and what polling shows that many Republican candidates are able to do this year, is maybe not win majorities among these voter groups, but cut into Democratic advantages. And so let me give you one example as it relates to the Latino vote. So currently, and I'm going to read you the statistics because I want to make sure I get them right. Currently, according to a recent NBC Telemundo poll that came out not too long ago, they asked Latinos which party they favored for Congress. 54% of Latinos said that they favored Democrats. 33% said that they favored, 54% said that they favored Democrats. 33% said that they favored Republicans. So that's a very large advantage for Democrats. But let me give you some historical perspective. So that's a 21-point margin, 54 to 33 in favor of Democrats. In 2020, 2 years ago, that margin was 26 points. In 2018, that margin was 34 points. In 2016, it was 38 points. And 10 years ago, in 2012, the Democrats enjoyed a 42% margin of advantage with Latino voters. So over the course of 10 years, that margin has been cut almost in half. And what we're seeing among both Latino and Black voters is that, in particular, young men from both of those two communities have been willing to vote for Republicans, not in majorities or anything close to it, but in much larger numbers in the past. And if you were the Democrats running in a very closely contested statewide race in a state like Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania, even a small shift of Black or Latino votes in cities like Milwaukee or Detroit or Philadelphia can be the difference between winning and losing.
In some of your research and looking at focus groups and then crosstabs, which are, for those who don't follow polling, are breakdowns of various attitudes on various issues. Are Jews in the United States, of course, they're concerned about anti-Semitism, but going with anti-Semitism, of crime, harassment, physical attacks on the streets, whether it's in restaurants in Beverly Hills or in New York City, in the Hasidic Haredi community, is the crime issue driving Jews and other groups away from Democrats, for example?
Only slightly. In the Jewish community, at least, we're seeing more of a switch on criminal justice issues among Latino and Black voters. But for the Jewish community, that has not been nearly as much of a vote differentiator. To go to the first part of your question, though, Hal, about hate crime, about the more specific category of hate crimes against underrepresented groups, just as Republicans enjoy the type of advantage I talked about earlier as it related to issues on Israel, on these types of issues, hate crimes, bias, that sort of thing, the Democrats enjoy an equally pronounced advantage with Jewish voters. So all of a sudden, you do begin to see the dichotomy in the community, depending on the issue at hand. Now, one of the things I heard over the years, as I'm sure you have also, Hal, from prominent Republicans, is they say, well, and Trump himself made this point in a particularly ham-handed way not too long ago. And I'm not taking sides for or against Trump, but I felt like he made his point about Jewish voters in a somewhat awkward way last week, when he suggested that Jewish voters were not demonstrating their appreciation of Republican support for Israel. And while I've never had the opportunity to talk to the former president about it, what I've pointed out to many Republicans over the years is it's been roughly 20 years since Israel was the top voting issue for American Jews. Right around the turn of the century, we saw domestic policy pass Israel in terms of the primary vote motivator for American Jews, for that relatively smaller number of American Jews who do make Israel their top voting priority. They too tend to vote slightly Republican. But for those the greater numbers who prioritize domestic policy issues, that's where the Democratic advantage comes in.
This summer, you wrote a very interesting two-part series for the Jewish Journal. That headline, paraphrase the headline, "Support for Israel among American Jews, certain categories, is fraying at the edges." And I think you used the Pew recent study, especially among young people, et cetera. Would you go into that just a little bit, because that's another sign that concerns many of us?
I'm so glad you raised this, Hal, because while it's not directly related to next month's elections, I think this is a real problem and potential crisis for the American Jewish community and its relationship with Israel. The generation gap that has emerged over the years in terms of Jewish voters' attitude towards Israel has become absolutely immense. And let me, if I may, quote a few statistics for you, again, also from the Pew survey. Among all voters, the feelings toward Israel are positive, 55 to 41. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, it's almost exactly the opposite, 41% favorable and 56% unfavorable. Among the oldest voting group, those aged 65 and over, support for Israel, and this is all communities, not just the Jewish community, is 69% positive, 27% against. So let's compare and contrast 65 and over with the youngest age cohort, 18 to 29. 28% more older voters feel favorable toward Israel. and 14%, and 29% of older voters, fewer, feel negative about Israel. And so what we're seeing here is that as millennials and Gen Z move into positions of leadership, statistically speaking, we're much less likely to see that generation as supportive of Israel. And when I talked, for example, about those office holders who were very supportive, I mentioned Biden and Pelosi and Schumer, all of whom, I'll say diplomatically, are in that older age group. And in the younger generations of leaders of both parties is where you see the divisions begin to emerge. And I worry greatly, Hal, that among the broader electorate, but even in the Jewish community, we find that young Jews tend to have much less positive feelings toward Israel than their parents and grandparents. And until we make significant adjustments in the way we talk about Israel to young people, Jews and non-Jews alike, the challenge we're facing is only going to continue to grow.
A broader question, and that is, in terms of U.S. positions on Israel outside of the Iranian deal, do you foresee any scenario, depending on who wins the Congress, where, well, we saw an effort, I think this summer, it was defeated strongly to limit arms sales and aid to Israel. Do you foresee any scenario of who runs Congress that aid in terms of dollars, weaponry, technology will change somehow?
Not in the immediate. It's almost impossible to see that changing in the next Congress in 2023 or 2024. But I'm not nearly as sanguine about that if we look several years into the future because of the generational skew that we were just discussing.
Very good. Question, turning to California, where most of us are from California, and you have a particularly expert eye on California politics. In terms of the Democrats are saying that, and Republicans are too, that control of the House in large part rests on what happens in California, and that'll affect all kinds of policy, economic, foreign policy, et cetera. You might spend a couple of minutes talking about, do you agree with that statement, given the House in particular and California's role, or disagree?
Well, when it comes to the House of Representatives, there are about half a dozen races in California that could, and I underscore the word could, impact the overall balance in the House of Representatives. I'll say this though, Hal, if those 6 races are influencing the overall majority in the House, that means that November 8th was a very, very good night for the Democrats. Because if 6 races can swing the House one way or the other, the Democrats will be doing much better than most prognosticators are currently anticipating. But having said that, even if there's a Republican majority, the size of that majority becomes critically important. And roughly, like I said, roughly half a dozen races here, almost all of which, by the way, are in Southern California, in the greater Los Angeles area, could dramatically impact the makeup of the House next year. And in particular, if you look at just in the LA area, Republican incumbents Mike Garcia up at the LA Ventura border, who won his last race by a very, very small margin, as you know, and fellow Republican incumbents Michelle Steele and Young Kim in Orange County, but also in Orange County, 2 potentially endangered Democratic incumbents, one being Mike Levin in the southern part of the county, but it also looks like Katie Porter might be facing a much more challenging race than had been previously anticipated. And so add in a couple of other races up in the Central Valley, and California could make a real difference. As far as the Senate, we know that Senator Padilla is going to be reelected by a very safe margin. And so what I'd say for those of you who are interested in the Senate majority, while there's probably about 7 or 8 races around the country that could still go in either direction, There are three Senate campaigns in particular I'd encourage you to keep a particularly close eye on election night. The first is in the state of Pennsylvania, where the Lieutenant Governor Democrat John Fetterman is running against the Republican Mehmet Oz, and that race has gone from being a very large Fetterman advantage to almost a dead heat at this point. The state of Georgia, where incumbent Democrat Raphael Warnock is running against Republican Herschel Walker, and the Democrats have a small lead in that state, given a number of scandals and controversies that Walker has faced. And third, right next door in Nevada, where Democratic incumbent Catherine Cortez Masto is running against Republican challenger Adam Laxalt. Right now, it looks like Democrats have a slight advantage in Georgia. It looks like Republicans have an equally slight advantage in Nevada, which means control of the United States Senate could end up coming down to that Pennsylvania race. And just to aggravate all of you who, like me, enjoy watching returns on election night, because of the way the state of Pennsylvania counts its votes, if the race is at all close between Fetterman and Oz, it's almost impossible that we will know until several days after the election which one of them has won. So Georgia, of course, as we all remember from 2020, requires their candidates to get 50% in the general election. And if neither candidate does, a special election is held in January. So if Pennsylvania decides the Senate, it could be days before we know who the majority is. If Georgia controls the Senate, it could be months.
Well, it's interesting. I personally believe that Trump's railing about fixed elections in Georgia and don't come out and vote in Georgia suppressed a lot of turnout on the Republican side. Otherwise, I think the Republicans might have had control of the Senate, but that's just my opinion.
If I can interrupt for a second, Hal, because it's a really smart insight. And we're seeing a similar dynamic this year in which overall early voting in Georgia is much, much higher than in 2018. We're still waiting to see the partisan breakdown on that. But at least right now, even given the new voting measures that have been passed in that state, it looks like turnout is heading to all-time highs.
Well, we have a couple minutes before Q&A, and I do want to circle back. We have a number of folks, our friends from Arizona, who are on this webinar, and also California, of course. And most of us on this session are in the district with Christy Smith versus Mike Garcia. Reapportionment made it more of a Democratic district, and she only lost by 300 votes. And it could make a difference, although Republicans have made this their number one priority. My assessment is, and I know Christy Smith well, I don't know Mark Garcia, but I follow his votes. Both of them would be okay on Israel related issues, is my opinion.
I think that's right. Certainly very profound differences on any number of other issues, but on Israel, going back to the broader point that we discussed earlier, I think either one of the two would be a very, very consistent vote for Israel's interests.
What about the Senate race in Arizona with Mark Kelly?
Okay, at this point, the challenger Masters appears to be falling back, and it's interesting to watch. And I'll be eager to hear if any of our Arizona guests would like to weigh in on this. But it appears that what's happening to Kelly's benefit is we're seeing an increasing number of ticket splitters, swing voters who in the past have voted for candidates of both parties in different elections, may be voting for different candidates in this election. And we're seeing an unusually large number of voters, at least in this era, who are going to vote for Kelly for Senate and in all likelihood for Carrie Lake for governor. But it appears that while the race is still too close to call over, it appears that Masters has been gradually falling further behind as some of his more controversial earlier statements are getting attention as Arizonans begin to vote.
Well, that brings us right to 8 o'clock sharp. There are a number of questions in the chat. I think we'll also entertain hands up, but maybe I will turn it back to Rabbi and Randy to control the questions, first from the chat perhaps, and then from the raising of hands. I think we might have answered Phil's question earlier, but I'll turn it back to you for our Q&A session right at 8 o'clock.
Thank you, Hal. And Dan, great job of condensing a lot of information into a very short period. I was questioning whether we were going to be able to allow for Q&A, but you have certainly provided time. I have a question before I turn to other questions, though. You know, it occurs to me that the United States has always been, Dan, a rather interesting exception to other countries in the world. Ever since its founding, the United States, I don't know, the Protestant pilgrim biblical tradition, the emphasis on the Old Testament in Christian thought, the United States has always been very favorable toward the Jewish people. It has not taken extreme positions among its citizens on Jewish issues, especially anti-Semitism, that other countries have. As a matter of fact, I think there was even a project in the early 1800s to establish a Jewish place of residence in the United States, I believe in the Buffalo area, to provide a place of sanctuary for Jews. And I find it fascinating, and maybe you could talk about it. Is there something unique about Americans or American Christianity or the political experience in this country that has made Americans always more supportive of, I won't say just the Zionism, but the regeneration, the rebirth of Israel, the concern about the Jewish people and their place in history? Does it strike you that America is different than other Christian countries?
I do think it is, and I think while your broader point is a really, really insightful one, Rabbi, I caution us from going overboard, because we've certainly seen very deep and ugly strains of anti-Semitism in this country throughout its history. But on a broader level, the premise of your question is exactly right. In my own theory, and I'd be interested in your opinion and Hal's also, is fairly straightforward. When Jews are treated badly throughout history in other parts of the world, it's because we're seen as outsiders and interlopers. Well, the United States is a country of outsiders. We simply don't have that history that certainly most European countries have. And so the immigrant experience is not nearly as unique for Jews here as it may have been in other countries in the past. Clearly we face challenges here, and we can talk about them in the past. But currently, I think one of the reasons that we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism is as a reflection of the broader polarization that we're seeing in the electorate.
Yes.
In other words, if voters are more and more inclined to look to blame, quote unquote, the other for their problems, we're not the only other, but we're one of them. And just as hate crimes against other underrepresented communities has increased dramatically in recent years, that us versus them context that has so polarized American politics between the two parties, I think also manifests itself in the type of hate and bigotry that is being displayed, maybe not in greater numbers, but more comfortably against Jews and other communities in recent years.
Thank you, Dan. A very, very, very important point. And just to state an interesting fact, Theodor Herzl wrote his book about espousing Zionism, Der Judenstaat. He wrote it in 1896. What many people perhaps don't realize is that in 1891, 5 years before Herzl ever proposed this idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, there was a petition that was sent to President Benjamin Harrison. He was president from 1889 to 1893. And in 1891, he received a petition asking him to use American influence to help establish a Jewish state in the lands of the Bible. And among the signatories of this petition were John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So it's interesting, for a long period of time, the great middle of America has been very sympathetic to the idea of Jewish return to the land and Jewish settlement in Israel.
This is why, Rabbi, I'm so glad that you and I are doing this together, because I had never heard that before. That is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I found it fascinating too. And it wasn't just those individuals. It also turns out a great number of other prominent Americans were also very active in advocating in this petition for the United States to intercede on behalf of Jews who at that period of time were facing persecution in other parts of the world. One other quick question, Dan. You mentioned the fact that among supporters of Israel, those in the younger factions, our youth, tend to be less supportive than those of us who are older. Perhaps that's because those of us who are older remember a time when there wasn't an Israel, and we remember a world there where we couldn't take advantage of a Jewish state. But my question is this: given the preponderance of programs like Birthright and other programs that bring a lot of American Jewish young people to Israel, how do we account for the fact that precisely at the time we're trying to reach out to young people and educate them and bring them into the experience of Israel and modern Israeli life? Why are these programs not succeeding? Why aren't they working among young people?
Oh, I think the programs are succeeding. I'm a huge fan of Birthright, and I've seen other programs that take high school and college students and young professionals to Israel, and I applaud them enthusiastically. They're immensely successful. But you can't manifest a majority of public opinion on the number of people who can fit on a transatlantic flight. So the people who are going are developing, not all, but the overwhelming majority are developing very strong affinity toward Israel. Our challenge is for those, the much greater number who don't. And I think the challenge is a generational one. My formative memories of Israel, my formative Israel-related experiences as a child are the 6-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. Mm-hmm. For some on this call, for my father, the seminal memory, of course, is 1948. Mm-hmm. But what we have in common is a memory of Israel as a lone democracy bravely standing up against aggression from its neighbors. For a young person in one of my classes today, their experience is not 1967 or 1963. It's settlements. Mm-hmm. And many of us can make a very strong case on why those settlements are of critical importance for reasons having to do with heritage and security. But ultimately, particularly with young people, I feel like we fall victim to what I call the David syndrome. We American Jews, when we think about Israel, when we think about ourselves as Jews, we think of ourselves as David. We think ourselves as the underdog fighting back against Goliath with our sling. But if you ask a young person today, they're more likely to see Israel as Goliath. And let me put it this way. If I were to go to one of my students' parties on a Saturday night, that would be weird. It would be awkward. Now, don't get me wrong. I conduct myself well. I don't drink. I don't dance. I'm acting like an old boring guy. But the fact that I'm there is going to make everyone uncomfortable. By the same token, if Goliath shows up at David's party and proclaims himself to be David, mm-hmm. Not only is there an immediate disconnect, but what follows is a distrust. Because if the first thing we tell these young people is that we're the plucky little underdog, and that doesn't jive with what they believe, then we have no credibility for anything else we try to tell them either. Whether it's about settlements, whether it's about Gaza, whether it's about Hamas. So I feel like even though we know, we've earned our David status. It's taken us millennia, but we've all earned it. Even if we know we deserve it, knowing that our audience is inclined to dismiss it requires a fundamental readjusting of the way we talk about ourselves and our heritage. And I don't know that many of us in our community are ready to make that adjustment.
I hear what you're saying, Dan, and quite honestly, I think a part of the problem is with people like me, rabbis in synagogues. We've done such a wonderful job of speaking of the glories of Israel and maybe sometimes overlooking some of the more negative issues that plague Israel today. We don't really equip our young people for when they get to your classes at college. We don't really equip them to deal with the kinds of contrary opinions that they're going to confront. And maybe if we in the synagogue community did a better job of realistically presenting Israel to our young people, it would better fortify them for what they're going to experience when they get to the college campus.
I don't think you need to be so hard on yourself, but what I would add is, in addition to less flattering information about Israel, just acknowledge that when we talk about the challenges that Israel faces, that the person we're talking to might not start from the same place we do in terms of perception.
Mhm.
But what I would say, and whether this is for congregations or for Hebrew schools or for Sunday schools, I do feel like we do an exemplary job of teaching our young people about ancient Israel.
Mhm.
They learn in great depth and detail about the patriarchs and the matriarchs, about Moses leaving Egypt, Joshua knocking down the walls of Jericho. But we tend to shy away from talking about modern day Israel because it can be so controversial. So I don't necessarily know that it's a more negative portrayal, to your point, Rabbi, but just being willing to talk more, as much about the last 70 plus years as we did about the 5,000 years before it, could provide the kind of preparation that I think you're correctly pointing to.
After this.
Thank you. I'm getting a signal to let other people in here. Just to second what you're saying, Dan, I remember growing up, I was in junior high school when the Cuban Missile Crisis was going, and the idea of nuclear war was very real to me. I remember being in high school when the Six-Day War started, and I was all set to go over, because the world didn't seem to be paying much attention to what was going on. I was all set to go over and work in whatever way I could to help Israel to free other people to go into the army. My parents ultimately didn't let me do it, but I think there is a different experience for those of us who grew up in a different time. All right, let me, I have a couple of comments. Deborah, you've been waiting, Deborah Block. Deborah, you've been waiting for a long time. You've asked a question right at the beginning. So why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
She has to unmute herself.
And you have to unmute yourself in order to ask.
Try and unmute. Okay. It's real quick. It seems to me that the United States, the issues are women and homelessness. That's what we hear from LA and California. What is the view of Israel? Are those two issues important or not?
Well, just my own observation, they are important. In Israel, the situation of women is a little bit different. From the very founding of Israel, women played an entirely different role in the founding of the Jewish state. And while it is still an issue today in Israel, I mean, especially among the religious, the participation of religious people in an army where men and women serve together. So that is an issue. And the issue of homelessness and the issue of economic need and other issues concerning inequities in society. It is an issue in Israel. I think probably not the issue. I would let Dan respond to that. I don't know if it's the same kind of issue that the recent Supreme Court decision and other decisions concerning the homeless are in the United States. Dan, you see that as being similar?
I do agree with you, Rabbi. I'll offer two thoughts that may not be directly related to Deborah's question, but may perhaps provide some context for the answer, the answers that you just gave. When on the question of women, not only, of course, have Israeli women played such a dramatically different role in that country than they have here throughout the country's histories, it's also worth remembering, this complicates the issue, the tremendously influential role in politics that the ultra-Orthodox community plays. And so what that means is you have a certain number of votes in the Knesset every year that are less likely to be supportive of increased opportunities for women for not malicious reasons, but for religious reasons.
Yes.
And I think it's notable that over the last year and a half, under the two most recent prime ministers, you tend to see more progress on these fronts because those ultra-religious groups are not part of the governing majority. As it relates to homelessness, it's certainly a challenge in Israel, as it is everywhere, but not to the same degree, primarily because Israel is one of the most, we talk about this from a proprietary basis, But even if you remove our own religious and cultural affiliations, from a purely clinical standpoint, Israel is one of the most remarkable economic success stories in the entire world. But what I will say is going forward is, of course, as all of you know, Israel's economic successes are based to a large degree on the success of its technology sector. And the tech sector globally is hitting a really rough patch right now. And for a country like Israel that relies so disproportionately on tech for its economic success, there's some pretty difficult headwinds ahead. And so I would unhappily predict to you that if we have this conversation a year or two from now, homelessness will be a more considerable issue in Israel, given that broader economic downturn, given the challenges that the tech sector is facing, both there and globally. But two really, really good points. I'm glad you raised.
And Deborah, just an observation. All you have to do every Rosh Chodesh, every new Jewish month, is see the women of the wall coming to the regular kotel and the controversy that produces. It's a live issue, and Dan is correct. Recent Israeli leaders have recognized that it is not good to continue to allow this division between the religious Israeli segment of the country and women. We have to find a way of resolving, and whether it's either designating another area of the kotel for a more egalitarian prayer service, I would add the realization in Israel that people who are in need, there should be places for them to turn. In Israel, in addition to what Dan was just saying, there are a number in the religious community of charitable organizations. They're called gamachs, that see it as being their duty, the community's responsibility to care for the poor and the needy in their midst, and not to turn it over to government. So these are interesting issues. Okay, Arlene, Jerry, you had a question.
Yes, considering the fact of the repeal of the Roe Wade Amendment, is it hopefully probable that female voters may carry Democratic candidates to victory?
I think hopeful is in the eye of the beholder, of course. But what I would say is that one of the more interesting trends we've seen, two interesting trends we've seen in polling this year since the Dobbs decision. The first is for many years, for more than a generation, since the late 20th century, American public opinion on whether abortion should be legal or on whether an individual considers themselves to be pro-choice or pro-life has been almost evenly divided. And in the months since the Dobbs decision passed the court, the pro-choice cohort has grown very considerably. By significant numbers, we're seeing a much larger number of Americans calling themselves pro-choice after the Dobbs decision than we had previously. The other trend, which unfortunately may fly in the face of the premise of your question, is that while we saw a tremendous amount of interest, particularly among female voters, particularly among young female voters, immediately after the decision, that Dobbs would be a major motivator for them to vote this fall, those numbers have gradually dissipated over the last 4.5 months. And when the New York Times Siena poll came out last week, only 5% of Americans said that abortion rights was the single most important issue for voting. Now, predicting young voter turnout in particular is a pretty hazardous exercise, and I'm not going to venture to predict. But what I will say is, to a large degree, your question addresses the fundamental uncertainty about the outcome of this election. In other words, if young women turn out in large numbers based on their pro-choice leanings, then the Democrats have a fairly decent chance of holding their majorities and expanding them. If those young women do not turn out, as recent polls are indicating, because their interest in the issue may have dissipated over the last few months, then that almost certainly does lead to Republican majorities.
Does that answer your question, Jerry? Good. Sue, I saw you had a question.
Rabbi. No, it actually was more of a comment. It's more
Oh.
rhetorical. It just was addressing what you were saying about, the future younger leaders and that younger people don't support Israel. But, I have millennials and Gen Z, and they just don't learn about the Holocaust. And I've seen plenty of anecdotal evidence, on Dennis Prager and other forums that if it's not taught, there's no affinity or any, thing towards Israel. So it's very problematic for sure.
Well, I'm so glad. I'm so glad you raised it, Sue. You're not just preaching to the choir here; you're preaching to the preacher. I take great pride in that. My wife and I serve on the board for the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles, and one of the reasons we joined the board originally and stay so committed is the amount of time and effort they spend educating young people, particularly young people from non-Jewish communities, as to the importance of the Holocaust. And on most days, you can go to the museum right behind the Grove, and you see LAUSD school buses filled with kids from East LA and South LA and other underrepresented areas coming to the museum, not just to learn about the Holocaust as history, but how it relates to challenges they face today. And to me, that's the long-term solution to a lot of the challenges we've been talking about. So I'm so glad that you raised it and gave me the opportunity to give such a shameless plug.
And you're right, Jim. We all have to do more. The truth is that not only birthright programs, but I notice that now Israel is making it more of an effort to bring in Latino and African American leaders in various parts of the United States and in the world. They're trying to bring a greater sensitivity to Israel, and they realize that this doesn't happen by osmosis. This happens because we have to carefully educate and teach the next generation about these truths.
Diane Gilden has a question.
Diane, you had a question?
Where'd she go?
Is Diane still here with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
Because Dan mentioned about teaching people. Today I went to the Jewish Center up here in Los Gatos. Stan Dreyer, who's a 97-and-a-half-year-old Holocaust survivor, started playing drums about 20 years ago. He has a band. He was incredible. There were a lot of young people. The place was filled, and it was very amazing. And he's gone around to a lot of the day schools and the Jewish schools. So that's happening up here.
Right.
Oh my gosh, Diane, that's wonderful. Rabbi, for your next program, instead of me, get this man.
Well, unfortunately, Dan, that generation of Holocaust survivors are dying out. I mean, we know that there is a built-in period of time when we won't have the people who've survived any longer. And then you have children of survivors and you have others. The key seems to be, Diane, to bring other people in. Dan, you were mentioning your work with the Holocaust Museum. We've got to bring other people in, not just the people who were themselves victims. We have to bring succeeding generations and remind people that this is still an issue, and that's something that's incumbent upon all Jewish organizations.
Yeah. I remind myself, or excuse me, I remind my colleagues on the board as we begin to confront this challenge, is one, we're blessed with the extraordinary work that the Shoah Foundation does to keep these testimonies alive and available for future generations. But second, to your point, Rabbi, you're exactly right. It's not just enough to educate young Jews. The point that I make to my colleagues is Lin-Manuel Miranda, who created Hamilton, is, let's agree, was not a direct descendant of Alexander Hamilton. And if there are incredible young creative minds in other communities than ours who learn our story, perhaps they will continue to tell it going forward the same way that an entire generation of American theater goers have now learned about Alexander Hamilton.
That's true.
Excellent point. And perhaps as a result of the Abraham Accords and other kinds of initiatives that Israel is taking to reach out to other Arab countries and find allies, even in places we might not have thought they would look. The fact is that Israel is working to increase its outreach and increase its impact upon other countries and different cultures. And I think you're right. That's a project we have to encourage all over the place.
That's all we have.
All right. I'm now going to go to hands, or well, I'll look at screens. Is there anybody we've had? Anybody want to ask a question?
Phil just said thank you.
Oh,
We may have drilled them into submission, Rabbi.
we may have. By the way, to address a point that Hal addressed earlier, yes, there are groups like AIPAC, and they're unapologetically, we all have interests, whether it's abortion rights, whether it's civil rights. We're unapologetic about supporting those, asking people we support to support those causes. Yes, Hal, there are groups like AIPAC that are around who have come from one direction, but there are also other groups of Jews like J Street and liberal Jewish groups that also advocate for Israel, but advocate in a different kind of way. I think it's healthy to have the kind of discussion we're having where Jews needn't all fall into unison or on their particular political point of view. We can differ with each other and still come together on important issues for Israel. Let's see, who else? You did a fairly good job. It's almost 26 after, Dan. I'm amazed here. Does anybody else have a comment before I make some closing comments? Okay, have we checked
No, I'm
both screens?
looking in the chat.
Checking, looking in the chat, looking at screens. Anybody raising a hand here? Oh,
Jerry.
Jerry, go ahead.
What is Dan's last name?
Dan's last name is Schnur, Schnur. And by the way, Dan, let's do a shout out. People are no doubt going to be interested in following you. How can people follow you? How can the people experience you if they want to reach you in other settings?
Well, I do write a weekly column for the LA Jewish Journal. And so for those of you who don't subscribe, it's available online. And hopefully, I don't always write about Jewish community and Israel related issues, but most of the time do, in addition to local and state and national US politics. I also host a webinars, as Hal mentioned, for the LA World Affairs Council. I just put the website of the World Affairs Council in the chat box. The webinars are usually monthly, but because of the election, we're doing an extra one both in October and November. Our next webinar will be this upcoming Tuesday night, October 25th. And then we'll do another one on election night between 5 and 6 p.m. before you start to tune into the results on cable television. And if you want to either read or hear more of me, those are both great ways of doing it. And if you've decided that an hour and 27 minutes of Schnur is enough, I promise you my feelings aren't hurt. I still come to the same decision every week.
Well, Dan, you also have your own political website.
Oh, that's right. DanSchnurPolitics.com. And my columns from both the Jewish Journal and my weekly blog can be found on that also, usually about national politics.
We will get out word to everybody or everybody who's on tonight. We'll make sure that we spread word as to how you can reach Dan. I suspect that this may be an introduction for some of you. For some of you, that introduction is going to lead to a lot more opportunities to read Dan in the Jewish press and to join him on the various forums where he speaks. I must say that Dan, Hal, I always defer to people like the both of you who, have politics and political science in your blood and have done this in many different forums. You are my experts. I wouldn't attempt to do a session like this without consulting experts like you. And perhaps, Dan, I don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks, but maybe after everything settles, and if in the future, the people who are on the site tonight would be interested in a follow-up session talking about how all the predictions we made or all the issues we raised, how did it really come down? How did it reflect itself in what was happening, what's happening in Israel and the United States? It might be interesting to have a follow-up session for our group.
Well, Rabbi, I don't know about you, but I worked really, really hard not to make any predictions. So I'd love to do a follow-up session, but they can't pin either of us down.
All right, that sounds fine. That sounds great. And by the way, I just want to make mention of the fact that those of you who would like to hear the comments that Dan and Hal have made tonight, because it went by very quickly. Tomorrow morning, this will be posted to the Learning House. We'll send you information. This will be preserved, this session that we have done tonight. And I'm hoping that those who haven't seen it, I can encourage you to come and to watch it at the Learning House. It will be available. And I really would myself be very excited to return to this topic and other topics. And Dan, if I can engage you and Hal to be future members or leaders of our group discussion, that would be great.
I would be absolutely thrilled and I'd be flattered. Rabbi, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed being with you tonight. And once again, I can't tell you how much I admire and applaud the work that you're doing to put these programs together. It's really impressive and it's very necessary.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you for all of your efforts in your work as in teaching at the university level, in your writing in the Jewish Journal, in your work on the Affairs Council. You have been a constant voice bringing to all of us, Jews and non-Jews, a focus on some of the important issues of our times. I think we cannot afford to be indifferent to what's happening in the world. And thank you, Hal, and thank you, Dan, for sharing all of this information with us. For all of you who are here, this is my final words to you. Tomorrow night, we start classes. The class tomorrow night is called The Long Journey, Studies in the Book of Numbers. The Long Journey to Freedom goes through a wilderness. You don't get there in 50 days from Egypt to Mount Sinai. It takes you 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Learning freedom is an evolutionary lesson, not a revolutionary one. And so for those of you who are interested, tomorrow night, we will begin a 6-week-long journey, long journey in the Book of Numbers, and that will also start at 7 o'clock. May I also say to all of you, it is wonderful to see you again, wonderful to be able to be back in contact again. I hope you have all had wonderful summers, and I hope you're ready to roll up your sleeves and do some serious study. Our discussion next month, we've already scheduled this, we had a wonderful Jewish ethicist and the doctor, Yolit Lipinski, who talked about the issue of abortion and Jewish law. She will be speaking about end-of-life issues. She will be speaking about death, dying, and issues that confront us as Jews with regard to Jewish attitudes toward what we can and can't do. She will be holding a very interesting discussion next month concerning death, dying, and Jewish law. So I'll send you more information. And then finally, at the end of the year, in December, around Hanukkah time, we're going to go back to the Maccabees, and we're going to ask the question, we Jews have known power and we have known powerlessness. Which is better? Is it better for us to be a powerless people or to be a people that possesses power? My suggestion is that there are lessons of both power and powerlessness that we should all learn. And so we'll talk about that in December. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Hal. Thank you all here this evening. Please, all of you, I know some of you are back east, so you're 3 hours later. Thank you for staying with us and tuning in. And please feel free to urge other people to come and see us as well. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, and if you want to unmute yourself or everybody, say hello or happy holidays.
Thanks, everybody.